Every Sunday, my husband visited his mother's grave, until I saw her in the grocery store alive and holding his hand. On today's episode of The Wander's Tales, we dive where quiet courage prevails. Hidden truths and hearts so bold, stories of fear left untold. If this calls to you, don't delay, subscribe, tap the bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The humidity in Lagos during the rainy season didn't just sit on the skin. It lived there, a heavy, suffocating blanket that turned the simple act of breathing into a chore. Every Sunday, like clockwork, Obinna would dress in a crisp, white linen shirt that seemed to defy the sweltering Lagos heat, his face settling into a mask of solemnity that Zainab had come to associate with the sacred. He would spend exactly 20 minutes in the garden, cutting the most pristine white lilies from the bushes he tended with an almost religious fervor, before heading to the Ikoyi cemetery. For 5 years, this had been their rhythm, a domestic liturgy of grief that Zainab respected with a quiet, distant reverence. She would watch from the balcony of their Lekki penthouse as his silver SUV glided through the iron gates, heading toward the place where his mother, Mama Efua, supposedly rested beneath a slab of polished granite. To Zainab, this ritual was the ultimate proof of Obinna's depth, a sign that the man she married possessed a soul capable of enduring loyalty, even unto the grave. She would spend those Sunday afternoons alone, the silence of the house amplified by the absence of his steady presence, convinced that she was the wife of a man who cherished history above all else. She never questioned the dirt on his shoes or the way he smelled of expensive tobacco and jasmine when he returned, never once doubting that the scent of the cemetery was anything other than the fragrance of a son's eternal devotion to a matriarch taken too soon. The silence of their home was architectural, built into the very walls of the minimalist, open-plan space that Obinna had designed himself. As a structural engineer, he dealt in loads and balances, in the unseen forces that kept the ceiling from collapsing, and Zainab often felt that their marriage was his most successful project, perfectly balanced, aesthetically pleasing, and remarkably sturdy. On this particular Sunday, however, the air felt different, charged with a static that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. As she watched the SUV disappear into the hazy horizon of the Lekki Expressway, she felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to leave the sanctuary of their glass-walled fortress. The house, usually a haven, felt like a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of her lungs. She told herself she needed groceries, artisan bread, the specific brand of Italian sparkling water Obinna liked, perhaps some imported cheeses for the week ahead. She didn't realize that her subconscious was already clawing at the edges of the reality he had constructed for her. As she drove toward the high-end supermarket in Victoria Island, the Lagos traffic seemed to part for her, a rare occurrence that felt less like luck and more like a predatory invitation. The city hummed with its usual chaotic energy, the sounds of distant Afrobeat and the rhythmic shouting of street vendors creating a symphony of the living that stood in stark contrast to the quiet, dead world Obinna visited every week. She stepped into the grocery store, the blast of industrial air conditioning hitting her like a physical blow, unaware that within minutes, the man she knew as her husband would become a stranger, and the woman she had mourned for half a decade would walk back from the dead. Obinna's grief was not a loud, mourning thing. It was a curated exhibition of loss that occupied a specific corner of their lives. In his private study, a room Zainab rarely entered out of a misplaced sense of boundaries, he kept a small mahogany table that served as an altar to Mama Efua. On it sat a single, silver-framed photograph of a woman with eyes like obsidian and a smile that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. A woman whose life had ended abruptly in a car accident just weeks before Zainab and Obinna's engagement. Obinna often spoke of her as a saint of the old world, a bridge between the traditional roots of their Igbo heritage and the shimmering, tech-driven future of modern Nigeria. He would tell Zainab stories of her wisdom, her grace, and how she had single-handedly managed the family's sprawling palm oil estates in the East after his father's passing. When he returned from the cemetery each Sunday, he would retreat to this study, the scent of the lilies clinging to his clothes, and remained there for an hour in what he called communion. Zainab had always found it poetic, a beautiful trait in a modern man who could easily have been swallowed by the cynicism of the corporate world. She saw herself as the guardian of his peace, the one who ensured the house remained a sanctuary where his memories could breathe. She never noticed that the photograph in the silver frame was never changed, never aged, and never moved an inch, as if it were a placeholder for a reality she wasn't yet allowed to see. This particular Sunday, as she walked through the aisles of the supermarket, Zainab found herself standing in front of the imported spice section, her mind drifting to the dinner she planned to cook. She was thinking of the way Obina's eyes would soften when he spoke of his mother's jollof rice, a recipe he claimed had died with her. The grief he carried was a weight they both bore, a shadow that gave their relationship a sense of profound seriousness. She felt a pang of guilt for being out while he was at the cemetery, imagining him standing before a cold stone while she basked in the superficial lights of a luxury store. But then, the sound of a laugh, rich, melodic, and hauntingly familiar, cut through the ambient noise of the store. It was a sound Zainab had heard only in the old videos Obina kept on his laptop, a sound that belonged to a woman who had been buried 5 years ago. Her heart did a slow, painful roll in her chest. She turned, her breath hitching in her throat, and saw him. Obina was standing near the dairy section, his white linen shirt glowing under the fluorescent lights. He wasn't alone. Clinging to his arm, laughing with a vibrant, youthful energy that defied the laws of nature, was the woman from the silver frame. Mama Efua was not a ghost. She was a masterpiece of flesh and blood, dressed in a silk wrap that cost more than a month of Zainab's salary, her eyes sparkling with a life that had no business being in a grocery store on a Sunday afternoon. The architecture of Zainab's life was a testament to the power of structured silence. Their Lekki home was a masterpiece of glass and steel, a transparent fortress that ironically felt more opaque the longer she lived within it. Every morning, the sun would rise over the Atlantic, bleeding orange and violet hues through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the pristine white surfaces that Obina insisted on keeping clutter-free. To the outside world, they were the golden couple of the Lagos elite, he, the visionary structural engineer building the city's skyline. She, the sophisticated gallery owner curating the city's soul. But as she sat in the stillness of her living room after returning from the grocery store, the glass felt fragile, as if a single high-pitched note of truth could shatter her entire existence. The minimalism she once found calming now felt like a void, a space where memories were suppressed and reality was edited to suit a specific narrative. She looked at the imported Italian sofa, the hand-woven northern rugs, and the smart home consoles that controlled every light and temperature setting, realizing that she lived in a curated museum of a marriage. The perfection Obina had built was a load-bearing wall, and she had just discovered a crack that ran from the foundation to the roof. She found herself touching the glass, wondering if the reflections she saw were the real versions of themselves, or just the projections they allowed the world to see. When Obina finally returned that evening, the mechanical hum of the garage door sounded like a death knell. He walked in with his usual practiced grace, the scent of the lilies still faintly clinging to his skin, a smell that now turned Zainab's stomach. He greeted her with the same tender kiss on the forehead, the same, "How was your day, my love?" that had anchored her for 5 years. Watching him move through the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of chilled water and discussing the progress of a bridge project in Ikoyi, was a masterclass in psychological horror. How could a man look so familiar while being a complete stranger? He spoke of the peace he found at the cemetery, describing the way the wind moved through the trees near his mother's grave, while Zainab's mind looped the image of him in the grocery store, laughing with a woman who was supposed to be bones and dust. She watched the muscles in his jaw as he spoke, looking for a twitch, a tell, a sign of the man who had just been leading a double life. But there was nothing. His performance was flawless, polished by years of repetition. It was then she realized that the glass house wasn't built to let light in. It was built to monitor the reflection of the person inside, ensuring they never stepped out of character. The memory of the supermarket was a jagged shard in Zainab's mind. The sensory details were hyper-vivid. The smell of fresh rotisserie chicken mixing with the sterile scent of floor wax. The hum of the industrial freezers, and the way the overhead lights turned the woman's skin into burnished gold. Zainab had ducked behind a display of imported chocolates, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had watched them through the gaps in the shelving, her eyes wide and burning. Mama Efua, the woman she had seen in countless funeral programs, the woman whose death had been the catalyst for Obina's deep, brooding melancholy, was picking out avocados. She wasn't a specter or a hallucination. She was choosing fruit with the meticulousness of a woman who expected to eat it for breakfast the next morning. Obina stood beside her, his hand resting naturally on the small of her back. A gesture of intimacy so ingrained it made Zainab feel like an intruder in her own life. The grocery store, a mundane temple of consumerism, had become the site of a supernatural revelation. Every chime of the cash register felt like a countdown to the explosion of her world. She had followed them at a distance, her movements jerky and robotic. She watched them navigate the aisles with a domestic synchronicity that she and Obina had never truly mastered. They spoke in low, hushed tones, their heads leaning toward each other in a way that suggested a shared language of secrets. When they reached the checkout, Obina paid with a casualness that suggested this was a weekly routine, a Sunday ritual far removed from the cold stones of a Khoi cemetery. Zainab felt a wave of nausea as she realized the timeline of her marriage was a fabrication. Every Sunday she had spent respecting his grief was a window of time he used to build a life with a ghost. The realization that he wasn't mourning a mother, but maintaining a relationship with her, was a betrayal that transcended mere infidelity. It was a theft of reality. As she stood in the parking lot, watching his silver SUV pull away with the dead woman in the passenger seat, the Lagos heat felt suddenly, violently cold. The aisles of the grocery store were no longer just places to buy bread and milk. They were the corridors of a labyrinth she was only just beginning to enter. The drive from the supermarket was a blur of neon lights and the aggressive honking of Lagos traffic, but Zainab navigated it with a cold, predatory focus. She kept 3 cars between her and the silver SUV, her knuckles white against the leather of her steering wheel. They didn't head back toward the high-rise luxury of Lekki. Instead, they veered off toward a secluded, gated community near the ape wetlands, an area known for old money and even older secrets. The transition from the chaotic energy of the city to the eerie, manicured silence of this estate was jarring. The trees here were thick and draped in bougainvillea, hiding the massive colonial-style villas from prying eyes. When Obina finally pulled into a long, winding driveway flanked by stone lions, Zainab parked her car a block away and approached on foot, slipping through the shadows like a ghost herself. She watched from behind a thicket of hibiscus as the car doors opened. Mama Efua stepped out, her movements fluid and regal, and Obina followed. He didn't just help her out. He leaned down and kissed her cheek with a tenderness that shattered Zainab's heart. It wasn't the kiss of son to a mother. It was the kiss of a man who worshipped the ground she walked on. Standing there in the humid twilight, Zainab felt her sense of self eroding. Who was the woman in the silver frame in their home? Who was the man who slept beside her every night? The reflection she had of her life was being replaced by an unfamiliar, darker image. She watched as a young girl, perhaps 4 years old, ran out of the house and into Obina's arms. He swung the child around, his laughter echoing through the quiet estate, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that he had never once shared with Zainab. The girl had Obina's eyes and the woman's defiant chin. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they were forming a picture that made no sense. This wasn't just a secret family. It was a secret universe. Zainab felt a terrifying urge to scream, to run into the light and demand to be seen, but she remained paralyzed in the darkness. She realized then that she wasn't the protagonist of her own life. She was a side character in a story she didn't understand. The unfamiliar reflection in the glass of the SUV as they walked inside was her own, a woman who had lost her husband to a ghost, and a child she never knew existed. The physical act of the kiss, that soft, lingering press of lips against skin, remained burned into Zainab's retinas like a camera flash in a dark room. It was the ultimate erasure. In that single moment, 5 years of shared meals, whispered dreams, and "I love yous" were rendered hollow. She stood in the shadow of a large mahogany tree, the rough bark biting into her palms, feeling like a voyeur in her own tragedy. The parking lot of the secluded estate was a stage, and she was the only audience member for a play that had been running for years without her knowledge. She watched as they disappeared behind the heavy oaken doors of the villa, the lights inside snapping on one by one, casting a warm, inviting glow that she was firmly excluded from. The silence that followed was deafening. The Lagos night, usually so loud with the chorus of cicadas and distant generators, seemed to hold its breath. Zainab felt a profound sense of displacement. It was as if she had stepped through a mirror and found a world that looked exactly like hers, but was fundamentally wrong. She leaned against the cool metal of a parked car, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The psychological preparation for what came next was a mountain she wasn't sure she could climb. She had two choices. She could storm the house and demand an explanation, or she could return to her glass fortress and wait for him to come home with the scent of the cemetery on his skin. The latter felt more dangerous, a slow-acting poison, but she knew she needed more than just a visual confirmation of betrayal. She needed the truth behind the lie. As she walked back to her car, her legs felt like lead. Every shadow in the parking lot seemed to morph into Mama Efua's smiling face, mocking her for her blindness. She realized that Obinna hadn't just been lying about where he went on Sundays. He had been constructing an entire reality for her to live in, a gilded cage where the bars were made of grief and loyalty. By the time she pulled out of the estate, she had made a decision. She would not be the victim of his story. She would become the architect of its collapse. Dinner that night was an exercise in extreme psychological endurance. Zainab had prepared a traditional meal, pounded yam and egusi soup, the kind of comfort food that usually invited long conversations and shared laughter. But as they sat across from each other in the dimly lit dining room, the clink of silverware against porcelain sounded like gunshots. Obinna was in a particularly reflective mood, his eyes downcast as he described the peaceful hour he had spent at his mother's grave. He spoke of the way the sun had hit the headstone, of the prayers he had whispered for her soul. Zainab watched him, her own food untouched, marveling at the sheer audacity of his performance. Each word he spoke was a brick in the wall of his deception, and she felt a perverse admiration for his commitment to the bit. The egusi soup, rich with melon seeds and smoked fish, tasted like ash in her mouth. She waited for him to finish for the moment when the son would return to being the husband, but the transition never came. He was staying in character, perhaps because the character was the only thing holding them together. "Was the cemetery busy today, Obinna?" she asked, her voice steady, though her heart was a drum in her ears. He paused, a piece of yam halfway to his mouth, and gave her a small, sad smile. "No, my love. Just the usual quiet. It's the only place I can truly hear myself think." The lie was so smooth, so well-worn, that it almost sounded like truth. Zainab felt a cold rage begin to simmer beneath her skin, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the meal. She wanted to throw the bowl at him, to scream about the grocery store and the woman and the child, but she held herself back. She was playing a longer game now. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the subtle lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He was tired of the lie, she realized, but he was also terrified of what would happen if it broke. "I went to the store today," she said, watching him closely. He didn't flinch. "Oh, I hope you got those peppers I like." The gaslighting was so effortless it was terrifying. In that moment, the dinner table became a battlefield, and the coldness between them was a weapon more lethal than any physical blow. Monday morning brought a clarity that only comes from a night of zero sleep. While Obinna was at his office, presumably designing more structures built on shaky foundations, Zainab returned to the high-end grocery store. She didn't go as a shopper this time. She went as an investigator. She sought out the floor manager, a man named Tund who had worked there for years and possessed the kind of observational skills that only service workers truly master. With a practiced smile and a generous tip slipped into his hand, Zainab began to ask questions. The tall man in the white linen shirts who comes in every Sunday afternoon. With the older woman, Tund's face brightened with immediate recognition. "Ah, Mr. Obina. Yes, they're our most loyal customers. Every Sunday like clockwork. He is such a devoted husband to her." Zainab felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "Husband? You mean his mother?" she clarified, her voice trembling. Tund frowned, looking confused. "No, madam. He always calls her my queen, and they behave like a couple who has been together for decades. And the little girl, their daughter, she always gets a chocolate egg from me." The collapse of the first lie was deafening. The mother wasn't just alive. She was playing the role of his wife in a parallel universe. Zainab retreated to her car, her mind reeling. The Sunday couple was a known entity at the store, a fixture of the neighborhood. The timeline Obina had given her, the funeral 5 years ago, the weekly visits to the cemetery, was a complete fabrication designed to give him a 4-hour window of death so he could live a second life. But why? Why the elaborate charade of her being his mother? And who was the woman, really? If she was Mama Efua, as the photos in their home suggested, then Obina was living in an incestuous nightmare or something even more complex. The realization that the grocery store staff saw her husband as a completely different man, a doting husband to an older woman, shattered the last of Zainab's delusions. She wasn't just being cheated on. She was being replaced by a ghost that had never died. The foundation of her world hadn't just cracked. It had disintegrated into the Legos dust. The confrontation didn't happen in the glass house. It happened at the office. Zainab drove to Obina's engineering firm, bypassing the receptionist and walking straight into his private sanctuary. He was standing by the window, looking out over the city he was helping to build, his back to her. "How is she, Obina?" "How is the queen?" The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the humidity of a brewing storm. When he turned, his face wasn't one of guilt, but of a profound, soul-deep sadness. "I knew you'd find out eventually, Zainab. I just hoped I'd have more time to explain." He sat down, gesturing for her to do the same, but she remained standing. "Explain what?" "That your mother is alive, and you're playing house with her." Obina shook his head, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "She isn't my mother to everyone, Zainab, and I'm not the only one she's married to." He reached into a drawer and pulled out an old, weathered photograph, 2 identical boys standing with the woman from the grocery store. "Meet Emeka, my twin, the brother I told you died in the same accident as my mother." The revelation of the twin was a threshold Zainab wasn't prepared to cross. In Igbo culture, twins were often seen as a single soul split in two, and in the old days, they were sometimes feared or worshipped. Obina explained that Emeka hadn't died. He had been hidden away, the shadow son of the family empire. While Obina was the public face, the builder, the success story, Emeka was the guardian of the family's darker, more traditional interests. Mama Efua hadn't died either. Her death was a strategic move to escape a blood debt owed by their father to a rival clan. She had died to the world so she could live in the shadows, managed by Emeka, the woman you saw at the store. She is married to Emeka, but because we are twins, because we're the same blood, the lines between our lives have always been blurred. When I go there on Sundays, I'm not just visiting a mother. I'm stepping into the life that was stolen from my brother. The logic was twisted, a cultural and psychological knot that Zainab couldn't begin to untangle. She looked at the man before her and saw not one husband, but a fragment of a whole she had never been allowed to see. "So, you're telling me that every Sunday you go to that house and pretend to be your brother? To be a husband to your own mother?" Zainab's voice was a whip, cracking the tension in the room. Obina winced, the term pretend clearly stinging. "It's not pretending, Zainab. It's a duty. Emeka is unstable. He cannot handle the outside world. He lives in that house with her, and she keeps him anchored. But he needs to see the world through my eyes, and she needs to feel the presence of the son who succeeded. When I am there, I am the bridge. The ghost who breathed wasn't just Mama Efua. It was the entire family legacy, a breathing, hungry thing that demanded the sacrifice of Obina's honesty. He explained that the marriage between the twin and the mother was a symbolic one, a pact of protection that Zainab, with her modern, Western-educated mind, could never grasp. To the world, she was dead. To the family, she was the secret sun around which they all orbited. Zainab felt a cold shiver. The logistics of the lie were staggering. The death had been faked with the help of high-ranking officials, a common enough occurrence in the corridors of Nigerian power if you had enough money. The funeral had been a grand performance, a piece of theater that Zainab had wept through. She remembered the closed casket, the heavy scent of incense, and the way Obina had collapsed in her arms. It had all been a lie. And the child? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Obina looked away. Emeka's daughter. But she calls me Papa, too. In our world, Zainab, there is no mine and his. There is only the family. The realization that her husband viewed his identity as a shared resource was more terrifying than any affair. She was married to a man who didn't believe in the boundaries of the individual. The ghost wasn't just breathing. She was orchestrating every breath they took. That night, while Obina slept a heavy, troubled sleep, Zainab became a thief in her own home. She remembered a slight imperfection in the hardwood flooring beneath the heavy mahogany desk in his study, a detail she had noticed months ago but dismissed as a minor construction flaw. Using a thin palette knife from her art gallery, she pried at the seam until a small section of the floor popped up, revealing a shallow, velvet-lined safe. Inside was a stack of letters, tied together with a faded silk ribbon. She took them to the kitchen, the light of the refrigerator the only illumination as she began to read. The letters were beautiful, written in a sprawling, poetic hand that she recognized as Obina's, but they were all unsigned. They weren't addressed to her. They were addressed to my eternal queen, and they were filled with a raw, visceral love that made her own marriage feel like a pale imitation. I live in the light so you can thrive in the dark, one letter read. Every day I spend with her is a day I am counting down until Sunday, when I can finally be whole again. The letters were a chronicle of a decade-long devotion. They detailed the pain of the death, the struggle to maintain the charade, and the profound connection he felt to the shadow world of the ape estate. But as she read further, the tone shifted. There were mentions of the third one, of a necessary union that would eventually bring the light and the dark together. Zainab is the vessel, one letter stated coldly. She is the one who will bridge the gap when the time is right. She doesn't know it yet, but she is the most important piece of the puzzle. Zainab dropped the letters as if they were hot coals. She wasn't just a wife. She was a vessel, a piece of the puzzle. The love letters weren't just about betrayal. They were about a grand design in which she was an unwitting participant. The unsigned ink was a signature of her own erasure. She realized that Obina hadn't just been living a double life. He had been grooming her for a role she hadn't auditioned for. The next morning, Zainab looked at the family photos in their hallway with new, cynical eyes. There are dozens of them, framed snapshots of their life together, trips to Paris, London, and New York. And in almost every one of them, if she looked closely at the background or the edges, there was a child. She had always assumed they were the children of friends or distant cousins, the background noise of a busy social life. But now she saw the truth. The little girl from the ape estate was there, hidden in plain sight. In a photo of them at a garden party in Ikoyi, the girl was sitting on a swing in the far distance. In a shot of Obina on a balcony in Dubai, the girl's reflection was visible in the glass door behind him. It was a psychological haunting. Obina had been integrating his secret life into her reality for years, a slow drip of exposure designed to normalize the child's presence in her subconscious. She felt a wave of dizziness. The daughter in the frames was a testament to the sophistication of the deception. It wasn't just about hiding a secret. It was about rewriting Zainab's perception of the world, so that when the truth finally came out, it wouldn't feel like a shock, but an inevitability. She went to the guest room and pulled out a box of old physical photos they had kept before they moved to digital. There, she found a picture of herself sleeping on a couch in their first apartment. In the corner of the frame, a woman's hand was visible, smoothing a blanket over her. The ring on the finger was unmistakable, the heavy, gold filigree ring that Mama Efua had been wearing at the grocery store. The ghost had been in her house. The ghost had touched her. The realization was a physical violation. They hadn't just been living a double life. They had been living her life alongside her, watching her, waiting for the moment the vessel was ready to be filled. Zainab didn't wait for Sunday. She went back to the grocery store on a Tuesday morning, knowing instinctively that Mama Efua would be there. It was a hunch, a pull in her gut that told her the ghost didn't just haunt on Sundays. She lived in the rhythm of the city. She found her in the floral department, smelling the lilies. This time, Zainab didn't hide. She walked straight up to her, her heels clicking defiantly on the linoleum. The woman turned, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Up close, Mama Efua was even more striking. Her skin was barely lined, her eyes two deep pools of ancient intelligence. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look guilty. She simply smiled, a slow, knowing expression that made Zainab's blood run cold. I was wondering how long it would take you to come to me, Zainab. You've always been a bit slower than I expected, but you have a good heart. The audacity of the statement left Zainab breathless. You're supposed to be dead, she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. Mama Efua chuckled, a dry, melodic sound. Death is a matter of perspective, my dear. In this city, you can be whoever you need to be to survive. I died so my sons could live. And now, I've come back so you can understand what it means to truly belong to this family. She reached out and touched Zainab's cheek, her hand warm and terrifyingly real. Obina loves you, in his own way, but he is a builder of bridges, and sometimes the bridge has to be built in the dark before it can carry the weight of the light. Don't be angry with him. He was only following the script I wrote. She turned back to the lilies, picking out a bunch of white ones, the same ones Obina brought to her grave. Come to the house on Thursday. Alone. It's time you stopped looking at the frames and started looking at the picture. That evening, the heavens finally opened. A classic Lego storm descended, the rain hammering against the glass walls of the penthouse with a violence that matched Zainab's internal state. Obina came home soaked, his white shirt translucent against his skin. He found her standing in the middle of the dark living room, the letters from the floorboard safe scattered at her feet. He didn't try to hide it anymore. He slumped into a chair, the weight of the decade-long deception finally breaking his posture. I wanted to tell you, he whispered, his voice cracking over the roll of thunder. Every night for 5 years, I've wanted to tell you. But the debt my father left behind was too great. If she stayed alive, we would have lost everything. The engineering firm, the estates, our lives. The rival clan, they don't forgive and they don't forget. Her death was the only currency they accepted. He confessed everything then, the faked accident, the secret move to Ape, the way he and Emeka had traded places to keep the world off their scent. The double life wasn't a choice made out of malice. It was a survival strategy. I married you because I needed someone who was pure, someone who wasn't tainted by the shadows of our world. I thought I could keep you in the light forever. But the shadows always grow, Zainab. They always find a way in. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for a forgiveness she wasn't sure she could give. I love you. More than the secret, more than the debt. But I am a twin. I am half of a whole. I can never truly be yours alone until you accept the other half. The rain continued to lash against the glass, a barrier between their manufactured perfection and the raw, drowning reality outside. Zainab realized that her husband was a man who had been drowning for years, and he had been using her as his only oxygen. The phone call came at 6 a.m. on Thursday. The voice was Mama Efua's, calm, regal, and utterly commanding. The gate code is 1982. That was the year my sons were born, the year the secret began. Come now, before the city wakes up. Zainab drove through the early morning mist, the Lagos streets unusually quiet. the only sound the rhythmic thumping of her own heart. She felt like she was driving toward a final judgment. As she entered the ape estate, the quiet, Mama Efua had promised was absolute. It was a pocket of silence in a city that never stopped screaming. The villa looked different in the morning light, less like a haunted house and more like a sanctuary. When she stepped inside, the scent of jasmine and old paper greeted her. There were no servants, no guards, just the ghost who breathed, waiting for her in a sun-drenched library. Obinna told you about the debt, Mama Efua said, not as a question, but as a statement. She was sitting by a large mahogany desk, a leather-bound journal open before her. But he didn't tell you the most important part. He didn't tell you that the debt wasn't just about money or land. It was about a child. My father made a promise that the first female born of our line would be given to the rival clan to settle a century-old feud. When I had twins, 2 boys, the debt was deferred. But when Emeka had a daughter, the debt became due again. Zainab felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The little girl in the photos. The secret daughter. She wasn't just a secret. She was a target. I died to hide her. I died so I could raise her in the shadows where they couldn't find her. And now, Zainab, I need you to help me bring her into the light. Mama Efua pushed the journal across the desk. Read. This is the truth that the letters couldn't capture. This is the history of the women in this family, the ones who stay, the ones who sacrifice, and the ones who lead. Zainab opened the book. The pages were yellowed, the ink stained with tears and time. It wasn't just Mama Efua's writing. It was a collective journal passed down through generations of women in their lineage. It detailed decades of love, betrayal, and the complex maneuvers required to keep a powerful African dynasty alive in a world that wanted to tear it apart. Zainab read about the reunification plan, a strategic orchestration of events designed to merge the shadow world of Ape with the public world of Lekki. The goal wasn't just to save the child. It was to create a new kind of power, one that didn't need to hide. The journal revealed that Zainab's entry into the family hadn't been an accident. She had been chosen for her strength, her business acumen, and her lack of existing ties to the rival clans. She was the clean element needed to legitimize the family's future. You are the one who will take the child, the journal's final entry read, in Mama Efua's distinct hand. You will be her mother in the eyes of the world. You will take her to the gallery, to the schools, to the parties. You will make her so visible that they can never touch her again. This is the love story, Zainab, not the one between a man and a woman, but the one between a family and its future. Zainab looked up from the pages, her mind spinning. The betrayal she had felt was a tiny speck compared to the monumental weight of the responsibility being placed on her shoulders. She was being asked to be the shield for a child she barely knew, for a family that had lied to her for half a decade. Why me? Zainab asked, her voice cracking. Because you're the only one who can do it without flinching, Mama Efua replied, her eyes burning with an intense maternal fire. Obinna is too soft. Emeka is too broken. I am too dead. You, Zainab, are the only one with the steel to walk into a room of wolves and make them believe you are the one with the teeth. She explained that the rival clan was already suspicious, that they had been watching the Lekki Penthouse, waiting for a slip-up. By adopting the child, claiming her as a secret child of her and Obinna's own, Zainab would create a legal and social barrier that the old world couldn't easily cross. The sacrifice wasn't just Mama Efua's fake death. It was the sacrifice of Zainab's own autonomy. She was being invited to become the matriarch of a shadow empire. The realization was a heavy, crushing thing. The love story hidden in plain sight wasn't a romance. It was a war. Every Sunday Obinna had spent at the cemetery was a day spent training for this transition, a day spent building the emotional bridge between his two worlds. He hadn't been cheating on her. He had been protecting her from the truth until she was strong enough to hear it. Mama Efua stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the wetlands. I have lived in this house for 5 years, watching my sons grow old through the reports they bring me. I have missed weddings, funerals, and the birth of my own granddaughter. I sacrificed my life so they could have theirs. Now, I am asking you to sacrifice your perfect life to save a soul that belongs to us all. The psychological toll of the role play became clear as Zainab spent the day at the ape estate. She watched as Obinna arrived, not as the polished engineer, but as a man who looked like he had finally shed his skin. He and Emeka sat together, two halves of a whole, speaking in a rapid-fire dialect that Zainab could barely follow. They were different, yet the same. Emeka had a wildness in his eyes, a result of his years in hiding, while Obinna had a weariness that came from carrying the weight of the light. The little girl, whose name was Amara, moved between them with a natural ease, unaware that she was the center of a brewing storm. Zainab felt the weight of the two worlds pressing in on her, the world of high-gloss Lekki and the world of shadow-drenched ape. She realized that she could never go back to the woman she was before the grocery store. That night, she stayed at the villa. She sat on the veranda with Obinna, the silence between them no longer cold, but heavy with the shared burden of the truth. "I'm sorry," he said, his hand finding hers in the dark. "I'm sorry I didn't give you a choice." Zainab looked at him, and for the first time, she saw the man, not the structure. "You didn't think I was strong enough?" she said. He shook his head. "No, I knew you were strong enough. I just didn't want you to have to be." The weight of his love was as immense as the weight of his lies. He had been a husband to her in the light while being a ghost in the dark, a feat of emotional engineering that should have been impossible. As the cicadas began their nightly chorus, Zainab realized that her marriage hadn't been a lie. It had been a sanctuary built within a war zone. Zainab returned to the journal on her final night at the estate. She turned to the very last page, a section that had been left blank for her. There, tucked into the binding, was a small hand-drawn map of the Ikoyi cemetery. It didn't lead to a grave. It led to a hidden vault beneath the Efua headstone, a vault containing the legal documents, the birth certificates, and the wealth necessary to transition Amara into the world. But more than that, there was a final note from Mama Efua, written only hours before Zainab's arrival. The secret was never about betrayal, Zainab. It was about whether you could love the truth more than the lie. He has been waiting for you to understand, not because he wanted to deceive you, but because he wanted you to choose us. If you are reading this, you have already chosen. The final page was a mirror. It reflected Zainab's own journey from a woman who valued the aesthetic of perfection to a woman who understood the messy, violent, and beautiful necessity of family. The betrayal she had seen at the grocery store was actually an invitation. The kiss on the cheek was a signal. The letters were a map. Everything had been a test of her perception. She realized that Obinna hadn't been living a double life. He had been living a life that was too big for one world to hold. The love story was the endurance of a family that refused to be broken by a debt they didn't choose. Zainab picked up a pen and began to write on the blank page, her hand steady, her heart finally at peace. She was no longer a vessel. She was the architect. Sunday arrived, but the ritual had changed. Obinna didn't dress in his white linen shirt alone. Zainab dressed in hers, a matching set that signaled their new, unified front. They didn't go to the cemetery to mourn. They went to the ape estate to bring Amara home. As they drove through the gates of their Lekki penthouse with the little girl in the back seat, the glass walls didn't look fragile anymore. They looked like a shield. The transition was seamless. To the world, Amara was the child they had kept private for her own safety, a common enough practice among the elite. To the rival clan, she was now a public figure, protected by the glare of the media and the power of Zainab's social standing. The ghost had been laid to rest, not in a grave, but in the heart of their new reality. Zainab stood on her balcony, looking out over the Lagos skyline, Amara's small hand tucked into hers. Obinna stood behind them, his presence a solid, unwavering force. She understood it all now, the Sunday silences, the grocery store affair, the secret twin, and the dead mother. It was a love story hidden in plain sight, a narrative of survival that required her to see past the surface of the water to the depths below. Mama Efua remained an ape, the silent queen of the shadow world, but her spirit lived in the way Zainab moved through the rooms of her home. The lies had been the scaffolding, but the truth was the building itself, strong, resilient, and finally beautiful. Zainab looked at her husband and saw a man who had waited 5 years for her to join him in the deep. And as the sun set over the Atlantic, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The secret wasn't a betrayal, it was a blood debt. Now, she's offering a truth that could either destroy our family or save it. Would you stay after 5 years of lies? Comment Ghost to see the final chapter of The Sunday Ghost and follow for more.